Mathew Frith. I'm Director of Policy Research for London Wildlife Trust, one of those big bureaucratic organisations. I want to welcome you to Camley Street Natural Park, which was basically saved in 1982 by local activists from being developed on. Been a long 10 years effort to try and build on this site up until then. And it's been managed by us since 1983 on behalf of Camden Council, who took ownership of the site for £1 in 1987. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some projects that we had, a particular programme that we're undertaking with the Greater London Authority. Now, you may have heard of the Rewild London Fund. I think it's fair to say it's not exactly the most accurately named grant scheme, because its key focus is on improving the quality, the extent and the connectivity of our local wildlife sites. Our sites of importance for nature conservation, of which there are about 1,683, the number keeps changing each week, and cover about 20% of the Greater London area. And they are a core network of the local nature recovery strategy, as you heard earlier today. And since 2021, something like £2 million has been allocated, largely by the Mayor of London, to undertake a whole range of projects across a range of sites, including introductions of, or reintroductions of harvest mice, contributing to the beavers in Paradise Fields and Ealing, but also what we would argue is bigger, better, more joined up in terms of the Yedding Brook in Harrow, Beckton Meadows, Newham, etc. And the intention for this programme, and talking to the GLA, is to continue that in due course. But just to confuse matters further, there was the work of the Rewilding Taskforce, which I was lucky enough to sit on, from 2022 to 2023, published this report in March last year, and that was basically trying to look at the ambition of creating larger scale rewilding. And if you look at Rewilding Britain's website, they say the minimum size for rewilding is basically 100 hectares before things become kind of almost workable, where you just step away our interventions from manipulating that landscape. Of course, in London, that's going to be very, very difficult. And the task force itself really struggled with the term rewilding, as I imagine everybody in this room would be struggling to define it in 10 words. Because the battles we had in this task force is that some people thought it was about the larger scale stuff, you know, herds of wildebeest gallivanting over Havering. Others, it was about what was happening in the local patch, say like St John's Gardens, or on your balcony, or in your garden, or on the road verges, or in the roundabout, or in the school grounds. The task force took a broad view. So it looks at, from the smaller scale, largely in the city, the suburban scale, looking at more the kind of sinks, larger parks, etc., the river catchments, and then at the very edge of London, it identified in these yellowish blobs areas of potential rewilding. And that was published in March 2023, and it's kind of languished there. So we knocked on the door of the mayor, metaphorically, and said, right, we need to do something about these 11 zones. Are they actually going to be viable? Because this report was completed in many ways to a political timetable, so it was rather compressed in time, and there wasn't enough information gathered to really know what was possible in those zones. So I'll give you a quick calibrate through what those zones look like in bits. So zone 1 is Enfield Chase, and some of you will be aware that Enfield Council is already developing its landscape recovery project there, funded by DEFRA. Large scale woodland creation, which are only beginning to realise that there's a lot of deer up there. I'm going to touch on that later. Zone 1 also stretches further east to Trent Country Park, Further east again, we've got Zone 2, which starts at Fairlock Plain, at the western end, through the areas which have been extracted for gravel and restored since, and are still undergoing some further extraction through till 2031 or something like that. Through right east to Dagenham Park and East Havering. You'll notice there a large herd of fallow deer. You'll notice the browse line. For those of you who are familiar with Dagenham Park, its bluebells have disappeared, nesting birds have crashed, invertebrate populations are very low because huge numbers of deer which have not been managed. Management, kill. Ingerbourne Hill, so we're turning clockwise around the capital, where we also have places like Hornchurch Country Park, where again, a lot of this to many people is rewilding. It's kind of lower intervention nature conservation. Further east, Mardyke Valley, which has recently undergone quite a lot of landscape scale restoration called Land of the Fans, with the partnerships out there. Raynham Marshes, Zone 5, pretty much only the zone is occupied by Raynham Marshes. And then on the opposite side of the river, the less well known perhaps, but equally more, well, perhaps more fascinating in some ways, the Erith and Crayford Marshes complex, which is to some people known as cowboy country, quite difficult in that respect. And then we swing round to the chalklands of Saltbox Hill in Bromley, near Biggin Hill, Cudden Valley, into Croydon. This is a site that we manage. This is Hutchinson's Bank, next to New Addington. And then we zip over to Zone 9 in the Yedding Valley, London Borough of Hillingdon, known as Gutteridge Farm. This is basically the kind of middle stretch of the western arm of the Yedding Brook. We're including sites that we manage and sites that London Borough of Hillingdon manage. There's another element of that. And then right at the northwest corner, we have the Colne Valley. This is just one site there, Park Lodge Farm, which is owned by Hillingdon. It's had a tenant farmer, but it's not really doing much. It's not really a viable agricultural proposition, but it might be a rewilding proposition. Likewise, this is further up the valley, looking down towards the site where the HS2 viaduct is now going. So again, controversial part of town perhaps. And then finally, in Harrow, we have areas around Stanmore Common, Bentley Priory, etc. So earlier this year, we established a rewilding action group. Now, what makes this different from the task force is that we were very keen to have practitioners onto that group. And I see some nodding of heads in the room. There were some suggestions that we put forward, which I'm afraid the GLA kicked back on. For a whole host of reasons which I won't bore you with, unless you want to ask me a question afterwards. But this is a lot more practically based than the original task force, because all of these are doing something in London in some form or other, whereas the task force had people from other parts of the country who arguably didn't know London. And we've been undertaking since then a more detailed assessment of those zones, looking at where we could potentially take forward some large rewilding schemes, bearing in mind these are also capturing the activity that is currently being taken place by a whole range of organisations, including many in this room, local authorities, private companies, community groups, NGOs, etc., but also looking at the constraints of what may prevent things going bigger and better in some ways. And one of those is land ownership. So this part of London, in Bromley, unlike Enfield, for example, where they're proceeding with their landscape recovery programme, Enfield Council own most of the farmland in the borough. Okay, some of it might be leased to tenant farmers, but they own that land and therefore they have ultimate control of it. And it makes up a significant proportion of the borough. In Bromley, a lot of the land is completely chiseled up in tiny fragments of land ownership. And ultimately, the way things happen on our land, like here, like in the Royal Parks, is down to the landowner deciding that's what they're going to do. What we're trying to do is much more complicated, which is effectively retrofitting a principle, philosophy, and ambition onto a very complicated network, a map of constraints. So going through that process, effectively, we've just now chiseled it, whittled it down to 3 zones where we think there is potential. The first is Zone 2, Fairlock Plain to Dagenham Park, because Redbridge Council are already undertaking some significant work on Fairlock Plain. There is a landowner there, Crown Estate, who at a national level certainly are thinking of trying to be a lot better on their biodiversity work. And whilst in the eastern end, Havering had kind of said, well, we're really keen to do this, but we haven't got the capacity to do so because we're broke. This is another issue we have to be mindful of. That could come later. Zone 9, Hillingdon basically own most of that. We've been talking to them. We manage a couple of sites in that zone. They're likely to be taken forward quite quickly. Zone 10 is the most problematic of the 3 because it's just so big. And the land ownership of that hasn't really been defined in a great deal of detail. So the next steps is that we've submitted a report to the GLA. We're continuing our stakeholder relationships and liaison with landowners, particularly the local authorities. We have now, we're waiting tenders to arrive on Monday from consultants. I know this may send shivers through the room, to undertake more detailed assessments of those zones. And we're not talking habitat surveys, we're not talking species surveys, we're not talking detailed consultations with communities. This is looking at key constraints. Land ownership, services, for example, underneath the land, hydrology, issues which may basically define what that rewilding might look like in the future. And then there's going to be further work over those time, getting more detail before the spring of next year. Fundamentally, and we've been talking to Sarah and Francis about this and their colleagues, is how does this link to not only the local nature recovery strategy, but also the London Green Infrastructure Framework, the London Urban Forest Plan, etc., etc., etc. Strategies going everywhere. But I'm pretty sure this piece of work effectively is helping to identify those aspirations of the LRS on the fringes of the city where there is scale to do something potentially quite big. Now, when we talk about rewilding, everybody immediately jumps to these species. So whether it's beavers, white stork, wild boar, white-tailed sea eagle, which one of the DEFRA non-executive committee members suggested could be flying down the Thames in 5 years. We have these proxies, tried and tested. We know that this works. Pigs in Holland Park, if you saw those 15 years ago, magnificent. Didn't work, but the cattle did. It's not overlooking the small, fundamentally. It's about, let's keep in sight the rich biodiversity we've got in this capital and not get hoodwinked into flagship things which may get people excited but ultimately aren't really doing things for London's nature. And of the deer, we just need to be mindful. We've got a problem coming afoot, and we are going to be launching a deer strategy for London here on November the 14th. Thank you very much.